Welcome to APG's first and only podcast. And Susan, possibly our last, depending how things go here.
We'll see.
Yes. My name is Sean Kief, and I am your host, along with Susan Thompson, who will be our co-host. Susan is the CCOM historian and just full of information. And today's podcast is called APG's Hidden History. And Susan, would you like to tell us why?
Sure. So let's think about what that means when we say APG's hidden history. Because right now, APG has been here for over 100 years, or an active military installation. But there was a lot of things that happened in this area before APG came. And a lot of that history is not available to the public to come and visit because we're an active military installation. You just can't come here, and some of the things are dangerous.
You're absolutely right. And before we start, I'd like to say, and this is with peace and love, please do not come onto the installation looking to find these locations that we may speak about. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes. There are laws against it as well. We are federally protected property, so
correct.
Just enjoy the stories as we tell them. If you have questions, we're around, but this is more for people's general knowledge to get a sense of what was here because those stories are lost and hidden sometimes. So that's what we're here to talk about.
And that is correct. And not only is it our premiere episode, Susan, but it's also our Halloween episode.
Ooh.
And that pretty much sums everything up.
That's right.
Okay. So today's episode, I've taken it upon myself, Susan, to call Hubble, Bubble, Toil, and Trouble.
Well, that's interesting because you aren't the first person to associate Edwin Hubble with lines from Shakespeare. So we can get into that a little bit more.
Let's do it.
Okay. Our first episode is going to be focused on one of the islands that's right off the coast of the coastline of APG. And APG covers over 72,000 acres of land, and a lot of that is along the Chesapeake Bay. So, Spesutie Island.
That was good timing there. I just have to say that this is, we're kind of new at this. We have a brand new switcher and it's got lots of sound effects and we're all so excited. I mean, the whole G9 itself is excited. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
So I'm so sorry, Susan. Continue, please.
So the reason we chose to focus on Spesutie Island is because, for one, nobody can get to it. It's currently used for some mysterious military purpose that even I am not privy to. And but it really serves as a crossroads of American history. If you look back, it covers all the way back to pre-colonial history. So there was a lot of Native American activity all the way up to the space age. Spesutie was the site where APG tracked Sputnik 2 as it went across the sky. So we have a broad swath of history all on one tiny little 2,300-acre island that's right off the coast of APG.
Now, from my understanding, APG was founded in 1917.
Correct.
Spesutie Island was not part of the Proving Ground until 1945. About 1945.
1945, APG purchased the property. We had begun leasing it in 1942-43. The Ballistics Research Laboratory needed that space to do some of its very important testing that it was doing during the war. The Army bought the property in 1945 from the estate of J.P. Morgan Jr.
And this is the J.P. Morgan,
this is
the one and only.
The one and only, well, he's J.P. Morgan Jr., so his father was the one and only. But J.P. Morgan Jr. died in 1943. So it was around that time that the estate was being settled.
Okay.
So that was an ideal time for APG to get this island that they had probably been interested in for quite a while, but it was in the hands of J.P. Morgan and other rich New Yorkers because they had had a hunting club located on the island from about 1889 into the 1930s. It was still being used by those people. So
now, do we know how accessible the island was when it wasn't part of the Proving Ground for all those years?
It was accessible only by boat. The Army didn't build a bridge to the island until 1943. So it would have only been accessible, and it was only accessible through the Proving Ground. So after 1917. So J.P. Morgan, it was called, I've seen two names, the New York Rod and Gun Club, also the Spesutie Island Rod and Gun Club. They were given access through that was like a special thing that they were given to get to that land. But it wasn't permanently, it wasn't a permanent residence or anything like that. They would come seasonally for the hunting.
And this was always by boat?
This would have been by boat, yes.
Okay. So prior to that, though, was there ever a bridge that
Not
crossed?
that I've seen a bridge, but as early as 1816, there was a ferry that had been established, and that was when the Smith family, who we will talk about more, during their occupation of Spesutie Island.
That's interesting because I remember seeing a photo while we were researching this topic, and I thought it was a vehicle, a car, that was on a bridge.
Yes, there is a photo of a car, but it's on a ferry that's going back and forth between Spesutie Island and the mainland.
Gotcha.
Before the bridge was, as far as I know, the first bridge that was built by the Army in 1943.
1943.
Yes.
Okay.
So, because, it's interesting because Spesutie Island always served sort of as a link between the land and the water. If you're going back to the beginnings, the archaeological record shows that, there were never really any big settlements on the island, but that it was being used probably seasonally for hunting, gathering, especially fishing, collecting clams and oysters and things like that. So there's evidence that various Native American tribes, they were Algonquin tribes and Iroquoian tribes. So the Integrated Cultural Resource Management Plan for APG sort of goes over the history of the whole area. So that's where I'm drawing this information from. And they include historic context of prehistory as well as history. And in that, it really talks about how this area was sort of a frontier between those two really cultures. So it was probably not, a big settlement area, but that it was used seasonally for hunting and fishing. And it wasn't really until about the 1630s. So European contact happened in 1608 when John Smith, famous John Smith.
Captain John Smith.
Captain John Smith.
Of Pocahontas fame?
Yeah.
There we go.
Yes. Mounted an expedition up the Chesapeake. And he was in this area.
Correct.
And he named and mapped these islands. So he named, for example, Poole's Island. It was originally called Powell's Island for Nathaniel Powell, who was part of his expedition, and it got changed over time. And this Spesutie Island was called Beerson's Island. So, even at that time, John Smith talked about the bounty of the land and how there were birds and animals and fish galore. And so this was really like a natural resource wonderland, which it still is in many ways. And that's sort of what drew people here. Like it drew J.P. Morgan here, it drew other people, it drew the settlers here. So
Captain Smith, he didn't come for the duck decoys.
There were no duck decoys.
No duck decoys at that time?
No.
I thought that's the only reason anybody comes up this area. Just teasing.
Just teasing. But yeah, so So we made European contact with the Native American tribe. So around the early 1600s to the 1630s, there was a tribe here called the Susquehannocks.
Yes.
Which, of course, the river is named for. And they were the ones who really we have slightly more information on because they were interacting with the early settlers. And one of those early settlers was the person who named Spesutie Island. Do you know why it's called Spesutie Island? Because it's kind of a weird word when you think of it.
Is it Mr. Udi?
Mr. Udi,
Mr.
right.
Udi.
Mr. Nathaniel Udi was given a land grant for the island in 1658. He was already living there. He had moved up a couple years previously. He was from Virginia. And he called it Spesutie. Spes in Latin is hope. So it's Udi's hope. So
yes.
it's his, his big hope. And he built a manor and he called himself Lord of the Manor. And he was,
as one would.
And he was really kind of an interesting guy because he was kind of being the heavy for the newly established colony of Maryland, which was granted a charter by King Charles I in 1632 to Lord Calvert,
yes,
who wanted to settle a colony that would be more religiously free because he had converted to Catholicism.
Oh, okay.
So he wanted to settle a colony where Catholics and Protestants could live in harmony. He died right before the charter was issued. So it became his son's job to establish. Cecil Calvert is his son.
Okay.
So these names are very familiar.
It's all coming together now.
To anyone who knows anything about Maryland history, or even if you don't. You've heard of Cecil County. You've heard of Calvert County. These are all the names. So Cecil Calvert, he was only 26, inherited all his father's lands. He could not come to Maryland to administer them because he was fighting against the people who were setting up the Virginia colonies and the Pennsylvania colony to maintain his rights to the land. So he was back in England trying to maintain order, make nice, because England was going through some troubles at the time as well.
A little bit.
A little bit. There were a lot of civil wars at the time. So he went in and out of power, but he sent his brother, Leonard Calvert, to be the first governor. That's the Calvert connection. And then, so it's the Calverts who gave Nathaniel Udi this land grant. And at the time, Nathaniel Udi was the largest landowner in this area in what was called Baltimore County at the time. It became Harford County later.
Is this old Baltimore that was where the Proving Ground is now?
Yes.
Is that correct?
That was established about the same time in the 1660s or so. So yes. So the seat of Baltimore was
originally Old Baltimore.
Which is within the bounds of current APG, which is also off limits. But
yes, it is. And again, with peace and love, please do not come to these locations. Thank you.
Thank you. So as I said, Nathaniel Udi was a very interesting character. He had gotten into trouble in Virginia. I'm not sure exactly why. It's all very vague in the record.
So was this his main residence, the island?
Yes, he built his manor house here, and I did manage to find a description. It's long gone. It was on the northern part of the island, and this description was from about 1700, and it comes from an 1886 article in the Aegis newspaper about the history of the Udis. And it described the house as being a 25-foot house with shed 2 stories high, which is a pretty significant house for, the 1700s, having outbuildings, a 40-foot hog house, that seems impressive, and an old house, 20 by 15 with shed. So the old house is probably what he originally built, and then, the newer house.
So his residence is here on Spesutie Island. So why was he in Virginia?
He came up from Virginia.
From Virginia.
And he had established a trading post with
okay.
the Native American tribes. He was dealing in furs and things like that. So he was really seeking opportunities for wealth, as everyone was at the time.
Yes.
He hosted a meeting in 1661 at his manor house regarding the colonial interaction with the Susquehannocks at the time. So basically, they were reaffirming their treaty, saying that the Susquehannocks would agree to abide by the colonial rule that had been set up, that they would basically turn over anyone who killed a colonist to the colonial government, and that they would reimburse people for animals, livestock, things like that were taken. And in return, the Susquehannocks would get protection support from the colonists, which they ended up needing in 1663 when the Seneca from the north attacked, and the Susquehannocks managed to drive away with colonial support. So that sort of reaffirmed the relationship between the native tribes and the colonists. But eventually, I think colonial pressures just overcame, and the Susquehannocks had really sort of but had moved along between 1673 and 1675. So most of them moved south, first to the Patuxent River, then to the Potomac.
So being on the island, was he then protected? Was it difficult from attacks?
I mean, it's always been sort of an island of military importance in some ways, because you are a little bit isolated. You'd have to mount an attack by boat, but by the 1700s, really there was no threat anymore. But Udi died without any children. He married twice. He had an infant son who perished. The land ended up being passed along to his nephew, who was called George Udi. And they maintained ownership of the island until 1779, when they sold it to Colonel Samuel Hughes, who was the furnace master of Catoctin Furnace out in the west. So so that's the end of the Udi line, is about right around the time of the Revolution.
During the Revolution, though, was it ever? I mean, I know the War of 1812. It was kind of like a hot spot, but prior to that, during the Revolution, was there any use?
There's never, I haven't seen anything. I think it was just, it was used for agricultural purposes. There were tenants. I mean, so the Udi family owned it, but there were multiple families who lived on the island, and there were different farms and things. So, but so it really transitioned after the Revolution, and it became the property of the Smith family.
Okay. Now we get into our war heroes, correct?
We get into our war heroes. So the Smith family, no relation to Captain John Smith, as far as I'm aware, but a different family of Smiths. So the Smith family were a family of prominent merchants. They had emigrated from Ireland in about the 1720s. They were fairly well off in Ireland at the time, from what I can discover. And so basically, there were two brothers who ended up emigrating with their families. And so the person who purchased the property in 1802 was William Smith. And he was cousin to John Smith. And they had both come down from Lancaster, which is where the Smith families had originally emigrated to. They already had businesses, and they emigrated down to Baltimore around the late 1750s, early 1760s. And they both did pretty well. They were basically using the port of Baltimore to export grain and things like that. But after the war, William Smith was very interested, I believe, in setting up himself as a man of property rather than a merchant. And he went on this property buying spree, and he is documented. I got a lot of this information from the Herring Run Archaeology website. They have fascinating history of the Herring Run property, which he owned at one time, but they also go into his history and background quite extensively. So he bought over 70 properties around the city of Baltimore and then out in the country. There's no real evidence that he ever really lived at Spesutie Island. It seems that almost immediately he turned the property over to his daughter, Margaret. And Margaret was married to Robert Smith.
Okay, so Robert Smith.
Robert Smith, you may have heard of.
Yes.
He was
lead singer for The Cure, isn't that correct?
Different Robert Smith.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Different Robert Smith.
Okay.
So Robert Smith was Margaret Smith's not only husband, but I think it's like second cousin. So William Smith was her father, was cousin to Robert Smith's father.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
But their mothers were also sisters.
Okay.
So there was a lot. It's all these families. So it was the Smiths and the Buchanans.
Yes.
Who were married.
Okay.
Who had married and they created businesses in Baltimore. And so Margaret and Robert Smith were given this property, the Spesutie Island, and they're really the ones who built what is called Smith Manor on Spesutie Island around 1810 or so.
And this is separate from what Udi had built?
Yes, this is on the more southerly part of the island. So it's a different property entirely. But, they were aware of that property. And, I think there might have been some remnants of it at the time they were on there. But pretty much there were several large farms. But so Robert Smith, as we were talking about, had been the Secretary of the Navy under Jefferson. And he was terrific friends with Jefferson. And then he became Secretary of State under Madison. Is it Madison?
Your guess is as good as mine. This is fascinating. This is a wealth of knowledge.
So he was a very prominent person. So he was occupying this island and had built a very Jeffersonian type of villa on this house. There's no evidence that Jefferson was directly involved in it, but it adheres to those Jeffersonian ideals of architecture. So like a Roman villa using the Palladian model of symmetry and balance. So it was a fairly rare structure in Maryland. You see more of them in Virginia over the time frame, but there was very obviously, it was a well-known property and it had a giant pecan tree in front of it, which was a tree that Jefferson admired. So Robert Smith, pretty big in the government. His brother, Samuel Smith, was famous in Baltimore for the defense during the Battle of Baltimore in the War of 1812. So Samuel Smith was the older brother.
Okay.
And he had undertaken this trip to Europe before the Revolutionary War as part of his becoming, as the oldest son taking over the father's business. So he went to Europe and he was trying to establish, new trade agreements with England and other countries. So he came back right at the beginning of the Revolutionary War to a vastly changed country because he had been off in Europe and then he comes back to a land of revolution. And the Smiths were very much on the side of the Patriots. They were not loyalists, even though it would sort of make sense that, they would want to maintain their ties with England because of, trade. But for whatever reason, they were not. So Samuel Smith was involved with what's called the Maryland 400, which was a regiment that fought at the Battle of Brooklyn in the Revolutionary War. And basically the Maryland 400 is given the honors, I guess, of allowing the rest of George Washington's troops to escape.
Okay.
They were fairly well battered, like not many of them survived, but Samuel Smith was in one of the early regiments that managed to escape, but even though it was a fairly rough thing. But he was very aware of battle tactics and things like that. He was sort of responsible for the idea that he knew kind of where the British were going. Like he had predicted the Battle of North Point, like that it would occur in that area down in Baltimore. And he was a major general over the local militias kind of thing. So he was able to have troops prepared in order to fight back the British attack. And maybe it was a little bit of revenge because the British had taken over Spesutie Island where his brother was living.
Oh, that's right. They did occupy it.
In the lead up to
the bombardment
of Havre. So in 1813, they took the island. They didn't really harm anyone. It sounded more like it was harassment and a little bit of, one-upsmanship because they knew that this was, the property of a fairly high government figure. So that was the Smith family legacy, and they continued on there until the early 1900s. So through several additional generations, the Smiths owned Spesutie Island, and it was the Smith family who first collected the stories.
The stories.
The stories.
The stories.
Well, it is our Halloween episode.
That
John.
It is.
So they had stories about the white ghost dog of Smith Manor.
And that story carried some weight because that made it up until they were still talking about that and up until the 80s.
Right. And there was actually articles written about it, like in the Baltimore Sun, a 1954 article. Catherine Scarborough relates. She's talking a lot about the Smith family history, but she also talks about the legends of the old manor house, and more than one visitor claimed to see the shape of a white ghost dog, which would roam the house at night, most frequently spotted on the stairs.
The stairs, you say?
The stairs.
Wow. So before we go any further, so Susan, is this the same Robert Smith that is buried at Westminster Burying Ground in Baltimore?
Yes. So Robert Smith and his father-in-law / first cousin once removed.
Brother / uncle.
Right. Are buried at the Smith Mausoleum at the Westminster Hall and Burying Ground down in Baltimore. And you know who else is buried there, Sean?
That I do. Would you like to tell our audience?
Of course. If you haven't visited, it's a great Halloween activity, and you can go visit the grave of Baltimore's favorite man who died here, Edgar Allan Poe.
Now, that's some spooky stuff right there. And I do recommend making that effort. I think they used to. I hope they still do. They do offer tours of the catacombs down in Baltimore.
I haven't done the catacombs.
And while you're there, pay a visit to Robert Smith. They have a very large tomb.
That's right.
With his name smack dab on the front of it.
Well, as I said, he was a pretty important person in the government at the time. I mean, can you say you were friends with Jefferson?
No, I cannot. I can't do that.
No. So anyway.
And in an article that I found in the Aegis dating from 1958, it mentions a ghost roams Aberdeen Proving Ground.
Yes, the ghost dog of Spesutie Island.
And according to the article, it's the only ghost with a classified secret clearance.
Why is that, John?
Well, that's a good question. But it does have documentation here that the ghost was seen by the Clark family who occupied Smith Manor at the time.
Yeah, so the Smiths continued to own the property up until the early 20th century. It was the grandson of Robert Smith. His name was John Donald Smith, and he was actually a very famous botanist who explored South America and was part of the Peabody Institute overseeing that. And he donated a large collection of materials to the Smithsonian. But he, I think, is the one who collected the ghost stories of his family's house.
Because that's pretty interesting. Because according to this article, Miss Clark says that one night she heard the ghost dog and started down the stairway, which looked like a setter, and was walking toward her. Quote, "I ran back to my room and closed the door," she says, adding that the dog was never seen by other members of the family, although it was heard almost every night. I'm sure it pretty much sounded like that.
I'm sure, Sean. I'm sure it was just a cute little puppy, right? Right, Sean?
Nevertheless, at night, and always at night, members of the family would hear the dog. Sometimes it would be walking up one of the several stairways in the house, or walking down a hallway. Chapman Clark, Miss Clark's brother, also told the APG News that the pattering of the dog at night was a familiar sound in the Smith Manor. Today, the Smith Manor, with its shuttered windows, still stands with an eerie appearance of a genuine haunted house overlooking the Chesapeake Bay from Spesutie Island. And again, the house is no longer there.
No.
It's long gone.
This article was from the 1950s when the house still stood, but at this point, there might be a little bit of rubble, but that's all that remains of the once very famous and prominent Smith family.
That's right. Move along. There's nothing to see here. So, Susan, to get back on track. Okay, so now we are up to what year?
Well, let's see. So in the 1920s, there was some change happening. The island was sold to a development company. In the 30s, J.P. Morgan Jr. and two of his buddies from the gun club purchased the rest of the island. They had purchased about 700 acres in the late 1880s and had built a very elaborate clubhouse, which was very Victorian and large. But so in the 30s, they purchased the rest of the property. And then in 1943, J.P. Morgan passed away, and APG began leasing the property to use as part of their testing lands for the ballistics research laboratory.
I believe what attracted Morgan down here was the duck hunting.
Yes.
Because Aberdeen was so plentiful.
Yes. There were quite a few duck hunting clubs in the area of APG that were quite a draw for the famous people at the time. Grover Cleveland hunted at Spesutie Island.
Did he really?
Yes, there's documentation of him as a guest of the New York Duck Hunting Club.
Now, was Theodore Roosevelt, was he at Inhabited Grace at what was the well-known duck club up there, or hunting club?
I don't know.
Okay, we're going to eliminate that then.
Okay. I don't know about Theodore. Another famous person who hunted in the area was Annie Oakley. The hunting was plentiful. It was regulated somewhat, but it was sort of a mishmash of state laws. And so it was really right around the time that APG began to occupy the land in 1917, 1918, that the laws were starting to change because there was a conservation movement going on. People were starting to realize some of these once plentiful resources were going away. So in 1918, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was signed, and it was signed with Canada and Mexico, and it was basically to protect some of those migratory birds, including ducks. And it eliminated the practice of baiting ducks, basically making them sitting ducks, as it were. So that was outlawed, and they put more restrictions around hunting seasons and things like that. So while in the late 19th century it was quite the thing, it was a social thing. It sort of began, you could see the writing on the wall, as it were, that like this practice was going away. So while the Morgan and people like that maintained control, it was starting to fade out of popularity to some extent.
Had they deplenished the population of ducks?
I mean,
because I was told at one time, like in Inhabited Grace, you could overlook the water, and you couldn't even see the water. There were so many ducks.
Right. So I mean, I think they were still plentiful, but people started realizing that like there weren't as many birds migrating as that, it was noticeable in other areas. So that's why, these treaties and things came about that protected some of these species so that they would be available for the future for, to continue to hunt for pleasure. And so, duck hunting is still allowed. It's a seasonal activity, and it's monitored by, state regulations. But overarching it is the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So.
Okay.
So in the 30s, the Morgans bought it. APG started to take interest in it. They had leased land as early as 1926 on Spesutie Island to as a garage space. So the Ballistics Research Lab, and this is how we get into the title of our episode, as you said, brought on board a very famous scientist at the time, Dr. Edwin Hubble, who was world-renowned at the time as an astronomer.
So why would they choose to need the knowledge of an astronomer for BRL, which is ballistics?
And that's interesting. And most of my information comes from Gail Christensen's biography of Dr. Edwin Hubble, and that's taken mostly from the journals kept by Grace Hubble, Dr. Edwin Hubble's wife. She was a pretty prolific journaler while she was with Edwin Hubble. And
also his copy editor.
Right. He was a terrible speller from what I've read.
Roger that.
But it's all kind of vague. Like, she was told that he was meeting with important people. Like, when the war started, he was being asked by many different places to do this, do that. I mean, he got asked about code, to work on codes and ciphers one time. He was asked to participate in the Manhattan Project, which he turned down. And I don't know exactly why they picked him. Basically, they were searching for a head of external ballistics.
Okay.
Which deals with how ballistics, their structure and how they fly and that kind of thing. That's what external ballistics. I had to look that up because I'm not a ballistics historian.
Well, let's get an astronomer to tell us all about it.
So, I mean, it's interesting because Edwin Hubble admitted when he first talked to Aberdeen Proving Ground, he came out to visit, he had to look up what ballistics was in the encyclopedia. So this was not his area of expertise, but he was considered probably one of the premier geniuses of the time. He was known for basically discovering that there's more than one galaxy, because up until the 1920s, 30s, there was this belief that the Milky Way was the only galaxy, and the other things they could see were something else, but not other galaxies. So he classified them. He began working at Mount Wilson, which had a 100-inch telescope. It was the largest telescope in its existence at this time, out in Pasadena, California, in 1919. He had served in World War I. He was a major in the infantry. It seems like he didn't really see much action. He was in Europe briefly, but he didn't see much. But he had come to astronomy. It was an early interest, but his father was against it. He got his bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago. It was a fairly new college at the time, but they're, really trying to create a new Midwestern sort of Ivy League experience. And he was a Rhodes Scholar, meaning he was awarded a scholarship to go study at Oxford in England, and he ended up at Queen's College. But because of pressure from his father, he studied law.
Okay. So
Even
he's covering all the bases here.
He was covering all the bases. He was a bit of a very interesting character. He told a lot of tall tales about himself. But it is interesting because he was in the old halls of Oxford. I think it's the second oldest university in the world after Paris, University of Paris. But he had some encounters with ghosts while he was there because his old lodging, evidently they would be in their rooms and they would hear the stairs creaking.
Did you say stairs?
I did say stairs.
Could it have sounded anything like this?
It was something like
Very
that.
possible.
And they'd open their doors and there would be no one there. And so they ran a little experiment and they realized because the stairs were so old, it was about 20 minutes after someone had gone up the stairs. The stairs were basically rebounding and making noises.
See, there's always a reason.
There's always a reason. But he had other encounters and he was, even though he was a scientist.
He was still a believer in the
well,
paranormal?
Not really of the paranormal. He was open. He didn't like to come to a definitive conclusion.
Okay.
He wanted to see which way the evidence pointed.
I can get on board with that.
So anyway, as I said,
Aberdeen Proving Ground.
So Aberdeen Proving Ground, he's brought here. He comes in August of 1942.
Oh, so right at the beginning
Right.
there.
So right at the beginning, he was very pro-war, which was interesting because he was sort of with that intellectual class, and he had many friends who were pacifists, and he was very tied to England, and he had a lot of English friends who were like against the war effort, and but he was very much pro fighting the Nazis. He had seen war in World War I, and he was very upset with the thought that like the Germans were not keeping to the agreement they had made, their gentleman's agreement from World War I. So, that's probably why he agreed to come to APG doing something he really wasn't experienced with. But really just sort of creating a more rigorous research base here. He was really hands-on while he was here. There are stories of him. So at the time they were developing the bazooka to penetrate armor, and it was considered very dangerous because it kept misfiring and injuring soldiers who were practicing it, and they tested it here at APG.
Were they aiming it the right way? Was it like shooting behind them instead of forward?
But so basically he went out and shot it himself until he found where there was a defect in the design, and it was hence redesigned.
Okay.
And also during his time, his unit became specialists in the design and operation of bomb sites, because really they were working for the first time with figuring out how bombs flew out of airplanes, because they didn't have the firing tables that would account for you have to let the bomb go 3 miles before your target, and you have to know how it's flying through space. And
that's a big oops.
Yeah. So I mean, that's what they were working on here at BRL during the war and external ballistics. So by November of 1942, he was upgraded from a consultant to head ballistician, and he was given the highest civilian rank outside of Washington, which is a pretty big deal when you think about
Considering you had to look up ballistics.
Right. But, he and his wife, Grace, were very close. They didn't have children. But she was really kept him tethered in a lot of ways. But at the time he came to APG, there was an extreme housing shortage because APG had ballooned. And, there was no place for Grace to live.
Now, what about Hubble himself? Where was he living?
It seems like he was mostly living in a hotel in Havre de Grace.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But he was at the office until 10 o'clock at night. So really he was just sleeping, and, he was very busy.
Was the on-post housing, was it reserved for soldiers? Or officers?
It was just, there was no, I mean, he could find a room, but it wasn't.
It's like a barrack base.
Right. Okay. So his wife, Grace, was from a prominent banking family in California. She had been married before. Her husband died in a sort of mining accident when he was overcome by noxious fumes and then tumbled to the ground. So, and she also had her inheritance from him. He was also from a prominent family in California. So, she was a daughter of privilege, I would say, and he came from a fairly humble background, originally from Missouri, but he had sort of created this sense of himself, the old English. And when he first went to Mount Wilson, he was called Major Hubble because he was still in his uniform because he came right after the war. So he had sort of created.
So they made him an officer.
He was an officer.
He was an officer.
He was
that
an
from
officer.
his existing service or?
That was from his service in World War I.
World War I.
Yes.
So when he came to Aberdeen Proving Ground, is he a civilian?
He was a civilian. They had offered that he could either come on as a civilian or re-enlist as a lieutenant colonel. But the powers that be in D.C. thought there were too many higher level officer positions being created, so he never really he was never recommissioned. So he was here as a civilian the whole time, but he was a very high ranking civilian.
Okay.
So after BRL leased Spesutie Island in 1943.
So this is the government's first.
Real, yes, possession
of Spesutie Island. And they own it now. It's going to be.
Well, they're leasing it.
They're leasing it.
They're leasing it because, as I said, J.P. Morgan had passed away. Jr. had passed away in 1943. So his estate was dealing with all his properties. Mm-hmm. Edwin was pretty well connected. I mean, they had dinner with movie stars. They met Einstein when he came out to California. I mean, they knew all the people who were like the people to know. So he basically contacted the estate of J.P. Morgan and was told. Hubble did.
Okay.
Yes. And was told that there was, so of course there was a large gun club, but attached to the property was a very small house from the 19th century. It was like 2 rooms downstairs, 2 rooms upstairs with like a bathroom built on the first floor.
I've seen this. I've seen a photo of this building.
So he was told that he could have possession of this property for as long as he was there because they were trying to settle the estate and they weren't using it at the time.
So Morgan's estate is the one that allowed him to occupy the building.
Yes. So that was the only way he could get his wife to come out to APG and live with him. So because, he was working all the time. He was working till 10 o'clock at night. So, but they were, as I said, very attached to each other. The thing he did not tell Grace at the time was that the house was called Haunted House.
Yeah, I'd probably keep that to myself too.
Right. So it was.
My wife wouldn't need to know about that.
It was kind of a shack. I mean, the windows were constantly.
No, let's be honest. It was a shack. I've seen this photo. I've seen them in front of the house. It's a shack.
Right. So, as I said, it was like 4 rooms. There were mice. They had a wood stove, and Grace. They were used to having like a house servant. Mm-hmm. They were fairly
government work for you. What can I tell you?
Fairly well to do. And she came and was like, because the windows would crack, because from the time BRL leased it, the house was constantly shaking because they were testing. Oh. And one day while they were living there, the door blew off because of the repercussions from one of the testing. And by the time Edwin got back, it had been fixed, but and he never noticed. So I mean, one time they had gone away for the weekend, and the house was damaged in a fire from the wood stove. Mm-hmm. They put some soldiers on it, and like it was better than ever by the time they got back. But it was still.
Say what you want. I mean, from the photo, it looks like it was on its last leg, and who knows? It could have looked like that when they built it, but it was definitely, it's.
Well, I guess when the generals would come visit Hubble, they would shake their heads and say like. No lieutenant would even live there for fear of losing their social status.
Yeah, but I guess it was the payoff was close to. He was right there. He didn't have to go to Haverty Grace and back and forth.
Right, they were doing their work there on Spesutie Island. He was right there because they were also building the first supersonic wind tunnel at the time.
Yes, that is correct, and I believe that building is still standing. Correct.
I believe the building that one is. Yes. So
which. You do not come onto the installation. You do not try and find. But yes, I believe the wind tunnel building that he developed, right? You could say.
Well, the wind tunnel was developed by Caltech
Okay.
at the time. Like they developed a model of it, and he was associated somewhat with Caltech.
Did he modify it? Because I always hear about, being on the Proving Ground for almost 20 years now, that the Hubble building and the wind tunnel.
I think his group worked on it. Like were
Okay.
the first people to use it, to work on it for really using it for the ballistics testing. Caltech, Mount Wilson had an association. The observatory had an association with Caltech. They were both right there, and he, was at one point all the astronomers located at Mount Wilson were also on the faculty of Caltech.
Okay.
So there was a close association there. So really, he's there till the end of the war. They leave in December of 1945, closing the door, which never had a lock behind them. They came back in October of 1946. Edwin Hubble was awarded the Medal of Merit, which was the highest civilian award granted by the president at the
incredible.
time. So that's when they went back and took those pictures that you're referring to.
That is.
So
okay.
they came back and visited the house. So the pictures are part of his collection at the Huntington Library out in California.
Okay.
He was on the board of directors of the Huntington Library, which has, an enormous collection of art and literature and things like that.
He was out of here faster than an aerostat.
Well, he went back because he was continuing his work. So at the time they were developing a 200-inch telescope because they had Mount Wilson was in Pasadena, but so when he started there in 1919, it had sort of just come online. So they were taking pictures of these nebula. He always called them nebula. It wasn't until after his death that the term galaxies really came into use. But he developed the classification system of nebula, the types. He determined, and this is really the big thing, why he was famous, that the galaxy is actually expanding. It's not, because there was no clue really at the time. There were different theories about the universe. So based on the spectrometry of the light taken using these photographs that they would take on this 100, so the mirror was 100 inches.
Oh, wow.
So that's why it's called the
incredible.
100-inch. So like they could see back in time, which they had never been able to do before. So they were waiting after the war for the new 200-inch telescope down at Mount Palomar to come online, so that he could, because basically he had gotten as far as he could using the 100-inch telescope. He couldn't
He's like, hey guys, need a bigger one.
Right. So it is kind of interesting that later on, Hubble died in 1953. He hadn't quite finished his work.
Oh.
But, he had his apprentices carried on and finished doing his work. He had a sudden stroke. He had a heart attack a couple of years before, and, he seemed to be recovered, but he died suddenly. He didn't want to be made a fuss of when he died. So there were only 5 people who attended his cremation, and his remains were buried at an unknown location.
Oh.
And that only 5 people ever knew. And then once his wife Grace passed away, quite a few years later, I guess her remains were also buried there. So we don't know.
And no one knows.
No one knows where that is.
I bet it's not Spesutie Island.
It's probably not Spesutie Island, one would hope. But anyway, so in 1953, he passes away. In 1957, Spesutie Island is used by BRL to track Sputnik 2 as it goes across the sky using brand new telescope technology that they had developed to track missiles. It's kind of an interesting juxtaposition when you think about it, that like Hubble, who used the telescopes to map the stars, and of course, the Hubble Space Telescope, which is basically a large satellite telescope.
Yeah. That's pretty.
It was named for
incredible.
him in the 1990s. On the same small island, Spesutie Island, they tracked one of the first times a dog traveled in space. And unfortunately, you know what happened to that
It
dog.
couldn't be that. Well,
You know that would happen to that dog on Sputnik 2.
no.
Well, if you think about it, you know what happened to
okay.
that dog
Oh,
on Sputnik 2. So, the
Well,
dogs.
you think white ghost dog, you think, oh, it's possibly Zero from,
Right. So,
Nightmare Before Christmas.
it all comes together that, from
Yikes.
from satellites to dogs, it's all happening at Spesutie Island or did in the past.
Yes, it did. Well, I'm exhausted. I don't know how you
Well,
This has been very delightful. You're just full of information.
and I hope, the next time, if we do another
If we
one,
do another one,
we can talk about another island here at APG.
oh, do tell.
So we thought our second episode would be about Pools Island, which has, of course, one of APG's most recognizable landmarks.
That it does. And if you don't know what that is, you're going to have to tune back in. But you could do your own research while you're at it. But anyway, Susan, thank you so much. It's been delightful.
Thank you, Sean.
You're welcome. And until next time, this has been APG's Hidden History. And we will see you on the second episode.
That's
Thank you
right.
very much.
Bye.